And our first speaker is going to be Matherly, professor of marketing at the University of Oklahoma. He previously worked at Northeastern, at Tulane, and Oklahoma State. His research focuses on how digital communication platforms can be both drivers and reflections of marketing. And this is how this impacts brands, society, consumers. Very interesting stuff. And today he's going to talk to us about alienation without representation. So without further ado, please, Ted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning. How y'all doing? Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Very excited to see a very full room, especially for the very first talk of the day. So thank you all very much for coming out. I wanted to thank you very much. Say thank you very much to the Center for Customer Insights for inviting us out, putting on this wonderful conference. I think as a marketing academic, I don't get to do this very often. So you get to talk to practitioners at the same time. That's a really unique and awesome opportunity. So thank you all very much. And I'm really excited to kick off our set of presentations today because we're going to have some really cool presentations, some really interesting academic presentations. And the best news is it's only going to get better from here. So I want to talk today about this project that I've been working on with my friends Andy Lee, who's going to be joining San Diego State University next year, Amna Kamani from the University of Maryland, and Julian DeFreitas from Harvard. And this project is called Alienation Without Representation. And top line, what I want you to remember from this talk is that brands engage in costly rebranding efforts. And you guys know all about this from our last talk yesterday from Lori Zane. And so I'm going to just pick up right where we left off there. And when brands do this, they are doing this to address potential problems, either refreshing their brand, as we talked about yesterday, addressing sort of problematic or issues in their associations that the brands have in consumers' minds. But at the same time, brands need to recognize that consumer identities are often very closely tied to the brands that they use. Consumers identify with brands, they build them into their identities, they consider them reflections of their identities. And we think about how rebranding plays a role in this. We analyze this in the context of the rebranding of Aunt Jemima to Pearl Milling Company in 2020 and 2021. And what we find is that for consumers most directly affected by that identity of the rebrand, Black consumers, there's actually a decline in sales for those consumers. And we are, through a subsequent experiment, we show that this may be due to feelings of loss of representation in the marketplace. And I think what I want you to recall from this presentation going forward is that those rebranding efforts, even whenever we're trying to address some of those problematic associations a brand might have, we have to consider how consumers use those brands and what those things represent for them in the marketplace when we do those rebrandings, so that it may have impacts that we don't expect. So just to sort of start from the basics here, we refresh brands. Brands do these sorts of rebranding efforts for lots of reasons, and they engage in these costly efforts to do this. They spend a lot of money to rebrand. And it may be to reflect new strategic directions, new identities that they want to have, as Burger King did when they rebranded a few years ago, where they went back to an interpretation of their classic branding from a few years back. And it's sort of to show a new sort of direction for what they're trying to do. And as we learned all about yesterday, brands may also rebrand to address sort of things that maybe consumers' misconceptions they might have about the brand or negative associations. For instance, in the case of Lay's, this pervasive belief, as we learned, that they aren't healthy, or that they contain things other than potatoes and salt and oil. Right? So they tried to rebrand to sort of bring in this sort of naturalistic and sort of healthier sort of perception of the brand. And brands may also engage in rebranding to remove problematic associations, especially as consumer tastes have changed and updated. As one example, the Washington football team, or Washington Commanders, as they're known now, getting rid of some of their history after a long sort of campaign to address this issue. So consumers, on the other hand, when they see the brands, this rebranding effort, when they address this, well, they may react positively to this because they know that the brand is spending a lot of effort on this. They know it's a costly signal of this. It's credible because they're expending resources to change their brand. And for a well-established brand, this may work out well, as we saw with Lay's. They can see tremendous increases in sales and positive associations that are developed through that. But at the same time, anytime a brand changes, this risks losing brand equity. We're changing the brand. We're changing it in a way that consumers may not recognize it in the marketplace anymore. They may go to the store and not see the same brand on the shelf that they expected to see when they went in there. And so that may pose a risk to them, and potential loss of brand equity and loss of that recognition in the marketplace. And we sometimes see also that beyond that loss of brand equity, there may be other potential risks. For instance, as we learned about with Cracker Barrel, the loss of those associations with the brand that exist with this iconography that they use, the old timer sitting next to the Cracker Barrel, may have pernicious effects as well. And we see them get rid of this, almost an immediate 10% stock drop, and within 6 weeks they're back to the original branding. And one reason for this might be that Cracker Barrel's sort of core demographic is Southern white Americans. And they see this this brand, this iconography, they see themselves represented in it, and there's a loss of that representation in the marketplace. And that might be one reason why they see this effect. And similarly, Aunt Jemima rebranded back in 2020 in response to the sort of public pressure following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Several brands, including Aunt Jemima, engaged in sort of rebranding efforts. They, beginning right after that in 2020, they started this branding review a few weeks later, and then in February of 2021, they announced their new branding, which would be Pearl Milling Company. And Pearl Milling Company actually is authentic, to use a word. It was the original branding, or the original name of the mill in which their products were produced. And so there's a real history to that. It had real meaning for the brand. This was authentic, really. But at the time, there was a pretty big split in terms of people's perceptions of this rebranding effort. It was about 49-51% in contemporaneous polling, and there was some evidence for differences by age group, by race, and by political leanings. But from our own analysis of Nielsen IQ data on the consumer panel, we know that black consumers bought Aunt Jemima at twice the rate of white households. And it was one of the few brands that actually had a black person as its logo, which makes it kind of unique, kind of different in the marketplace compared to most other brands. And so when that goes away, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And, well, what happened? So up through, this is store level sales data, and up through the branding review, we have sales like this. The new branding's announced in February of 2021, and then we start seeing a decline that persists even as they roll out the new branding. And this persists through the end of 2021. And when we analyze this at the store level using a more sophisticated model than just looking at this in sort of model-free evidence, we see about a 24% decline in store sales relative to competitors. So why might this be the case? Why not? Why didn't this turn out the way that that PepsiCo wanted this to turn out? Why didn't they get the outcomes that they wanted? And that's really the research question we're interested in, is how do consumer identities affect the reactions to changes in brands? How do these identities that consumers hold change how they react to these things? And what we know about consumers and brands is that the identities that consumers have and the identities that they see in the brands that they use are closely linked. They're intertwined. Consumers form really close ties with brands over time, over their use and history with them, and that's especially true if the brand is effective in representing who they are and communicating about themselves in the marketplace. And so when a rebrand removes those associations, it may be viewed negatively by the people who hold that identity, especially if they use that brand, they use it to they feel like it represents them in the marketplace. And that may happen even whenever those brands have associations that are not positive. Things like the Aunt Jemima brand, which has a sort of very negative racial history associated with it that's been changed over time, but still derives from racist stereotypes about black women. And so what we expect is going to happen is that when brands remove those kinds of representations among the consumers that hold those identities, they're going to view this negatively, and it's going to lead to a decrease in sales and lower valuations of the brand. But we think that this is only going to happen if the rebrand is relevant to their identity. If it's not their identity, we're not going to see this effect for consumers who aren't reflected in the brand. And we also think that if the rebrand still maintains those kinds of identity associations, they're going to see this effect not happen. They're not going to see this negative reaction. So how I'm going to test this out is kind of 2.5 studies. I'm going to show some analysis of secondary data from the Nielsen IQ consumer panel. And then I'm also going to look at an experiment. And along the way, I'm going to show a little marketplace insights from Reddit. So first, let's look at this consumer panel data. So the Nielsen IQ data has information on store-level shopping trip item-level details from about 80,000 consumer panelists covering the period 2018 to 2023. So we've got a long period of time before the rebranding, as well as about an equal amount of time after. And among these 80,000 panelists, about 12.5% were identified as Black households, which is very close to the representation in the broader population. And makes sense because this is supposed to be a representative panel. But we also have a few other racial categories identified within the data. And the other thing that's worth noting about this data is that about 80% of people are retained year on year, and the average tenure of somebody in the panel is about 3 years. So we have long periods of data from these people. We can see their history both before and after the rebranding happens. All right? So what we did is we identified any UPCs associated with Aunt Jemima or Pearl Milling Company over the entire time period. There's about 105 of them. And those UPCs represent about from 4 major product categories, which was pancake mix, hominy grits, syrup, and cornmeal. Thank you. Sorry. And that represents about 99.8% of all of Aunt Jemima's sales over this time period. So this is all their products, essentially, or almost all of their sales. And for each shopping trip, we identified whether or not they bought any Aunt Jemima or Pearl Milling Company products on that trip, as well as what normalized sales were, the percent of their cart, how much they spent on Aunt Jemima products in each trip. So we use a difference in difference model where we're going to try to compare Black households to non-Black households before and after the rebranding effort. So we've got sort of a 2x2 setup here. And we include fixed effects to take out any sort of household level heterogeneity differences between households and over time as well. All right. And I'm going to try to breeze through the math real quickly, but just to sort of, for the empirical modelers in the room, the main thing we're looking at here is this interaction effect. And we've got negative signs for all of them. And the basic takeaway from this is that the incidence rate and the sales, the normalized sales for Black households decreased following the rebranding. But if you prefer this in a more graphical form, as an event study, we can look at this over time. And so this is relative to the rebranding announcement. And before the rebranding announcement, Black households purchased Aunt Jemima products at higher rates compared to non-Black households. And then in June of 2021, 2020, the branding reviews announced, and we start seeing these things close in. The new branding is announced here in 2021, and then right after that, we see a persistent negative effect, indicating that Black households bought Aunt Jemima products that previously had bought Aunt Jemima products at higher rates, now buy it at lower rates compared to other households. And we do some additional robustness testing on this. We look to see if there's any effects of political leanings by looking at we know the counties in which these households reside, and we can look at the sort of political leanings of those counties as a proxy for their political views, and we see no effects there. And our main interaction effect persists. This tells us this isn't something about politics. This seems to be an effect of race. And more specifically, it's an effect of specific to Black households. So we compared Black households here, and we see this negative effect. But when we look at households by other racial categories, Asian, other, and Hispanic, we see no effects. So this effect is specific to Black households. It's not affected by politics, and it occurs as we'd expect over time. And it's consistent with this idea that the rebranding and the loss of representation in the marketplace for Black consumers drove this effect. Right, but this is all sort of just observational data. We have no intervention here other than their sort of rebranding effort. So that leaves open a lot of questions about this. So as our next step, I thought, let's do some marketplace insights. So we had some data from Reddit. We identified any posts on Reddit where there were mentions of Aunt Jemima or Pearl Milling Company. We found about 4,500 comments. And we were able to identify through participation in certain subreddits that some of those participants or some of those comments were from people who were black. So we can compare and contrast differences in how black marketplace participants on Reddit responded to this versus non-black participants or community actors. And so I had Claude code their comments to say, are these positive, negative, or neutral about the rebranding effort? And for the non-black Reddit participants, found pretty even split, very consistent with what we see in the contemporaneous polling data from prior to the rebranding. That as a whole, people are kind of sort of mixed on this. Some people view the rebranding effort as positive, some view it as negative. But among black consumers or black participants in this data set, the effect is quite different. In general, black participants said that they viewed it positively. They wanted this rebranding to happen. They supported it. They didn't like this representation in the marketplace. But what's interesting is that we also see among those people who support it a lot of comments reflecting this idea or reflecting things about representation, about how black actors are presented in the marketplace, about seeing black faces in the marketplace. And more to sort of animate that, to give some more qualitative aspect to it, I pulled a few comments from this. Things like, I never really cared for that the stereotype, it's a negative representation of black women, and it's about time we moved away from that stereotype. Or misrepresentation is worse than underrepresentation. Or this person responding to another person's comment, I'd rather be represented by positive characters like George Washington Carver, Peanut Butter, instead of Mammy Aunt Jemima. And that's interesting. I think that's interesting. Because I think that's kind of the issue here, is that it's not about that these consumers want to be represented in the marketplace, but this representation as it is right now is not a good one. And so maybe if the rebranding focuses on changing that representation as opposed to removing it completely, we might see a different outcome. And so to test that question out, that's my last study here. So to run this was an experiment we conducted with the Prolific panel. We recruited 1,200 black participants from there. And we created a fictitious brand called Prairie Grains Breakfast Cereal. And we used, when we created it, the Aunt Jemima logo from 1950, which looks much worse than the brand logo that you saw earlier. And what we told participants is that due to renewed concerns about racial justice, there's a backlash against Prairie Grains. And for reference, this study was run in May of 2025. So this is well after the rebranding of Aunt Jemima. So we don't see any potential effects of carryover from that. Excuse me. And we showed participants one of three conditions. In the first, the original branding, we showed them this logo here. And this is the original Aunt Jemima, or it's not even the original one. The original one's worse than this. It's pretty bad. But this is the one from 1950. And we said in the sort of original branding condition, they're catching heat for this representation, and that's all we told them. In the no representation condition, we said, we're getting rid of this. They're going to get rid of it, and this is going to be the new branding. It's just going to be Prairie Grains with no logo like this. And then in the maintain representation condition, we showed them this version here, where we told them that this was the executive chef who created Prairie Grains breakfast cereal, and they wanted to represent her on the box instead. All right. And so we asked people to rate how they felt about the product and how likely they are to consider it. And we also asked them to rate their feelings of representation when they saw this brand, saw this product. And what did we find? Well, first, in consideration, whenever they switch to this no representation branding, we see a decline in product consideration and attitudes as well. They didn't like the new branding when they get rid of this logo. And that's also reflected in their feelings about representation in the marketplace, where we see a similar negative effect. But whenever instead we keep the representation in the marketplace, but instead use a more positive representation, this effect disappears completely. And it carries over in representation as well. And it wouldn't be complete without the path model where we show that this effect on product consideration is fully mediated by feelings of representation. That is to say, this change in people's consideration of the product was driven by their feelings of representation in the marketplace. Whenever they feel not represented in the marketplace, that leads them to not want to consider the product. So, in terms of takeaways from this, I think it's important for brands to keep in mind when they're doing these rebranding efforts to think about how consumers use the brand and how they integrate this into their self-concept, how they see themselves reflected in the brand. And especially when those are brands that reflect identities that aren't oftentimes reflected in the marketplace, it's really important to consider what that represents to those consumers and what that means for those consumers to be seen. And it highlights the need to consider that marketplace representation and to say, what are we doing with this when we try and make these kinds of changes? But it shows that there's some potential benefits to making these kinds of changes. There's ways to do this and succeed, but I think it needs to reflect those consumers' identities, and they need to feel that sort of representation and feel it's a positive representation, and they can still succeed. All right? So thank you all very much.
Question two, I think.
Yeah.
Hey there. So I was actually working with Uncle Ben's at the time when Ben's went through the same, very similar thing, right?
Awesome.
He made the decision to keep Ben's, remove the uncle to kind of find that balance you're talking about. So what role did Aunt Jemima as a name play, do you think, in this also? Because that has potentially has connotations just as a name, never mind the distinctive assets that we played with here.
For sure. I think both of those things present, it's the same issue, right? And looking at the Reddit comments, there's tons and tons of references to just being like, using aunt as a sort of a pejorative term or a term that has a lot of loaded racist connotations to it. And I think you probably would not be able to get away with keeping that. But I think if you can still, I think it's not so much about, they have to keep that name, but somehow keeping that representation, sort of saying like, here's this a black woman on the box kind of thing, I think really would make a difference there for them. Yeah.
First of all, that peanut butter comment was hilarious. So. Peanut butter comment, yeah. But you mentioned about separating race from politics, and I wonder how did you do that? How do you see the separation?
That's a good question. So in that analysis, it's admittedly kind of hand-wavy because the Nielsen panel, we know the location and we know the demographic characteristics of the house. We know that they identify as a black household. And so the only thing we have for politics is sort of county level voting. And that's what we use the Cook's PBI as an indicator of politics. And certainly that's not ideal for this case. But I think not seeing anything there isn't definitive, but it's sort of at least something that we have as a proxy for it. And certainly, there's evidence to show that, like, even in places where where the politics may lean one direction, black consumers typically tend to have different views on different political leanings, sort of characteristically. So I wouldn't call that definitive for sure, but I just wanted to try to do that.
And on that logo, did you see any study difference between, like on the Perry one, you had a modern picture, but then that's a complication because there's like a perm or European type style. Some people believe that versus Afrocentric type hairstyle. Did you see any pushback within your study that addressed that?
That's a good question. We haven't tried that, and at least in that context, I think it might land a little differently because that was all that study was done exclusively with black consumers, and there may be different sort of reactions if we had a more broad panel or a group that included non-black consumers to that sort of thing. And at least from that evidence, it seems like the fact that, to your point, that she's got sort of a non-natural hairstyle, that it didn't seem to be negative among those consumers. But it would be interesting to see if we included white people in the panel and we had her have natural hair, if they reacted a little differently to that. It would be a cool question.
We're out of time now, but feel free to catch Ted at the break. Thank you very much, Ted.